Good afternoon. This is David Bernstein, President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this edition of the CRCast, a bi-monthly webcast on Jewish advocacy and community relations issues for the Jewish community field of community relations. I'm really happy to have with us on this edition Michael Masters. Michael is the National Director and CEO of the Secure Community Network, SCAN. He's been at this job for how long, Michael, now?
22 months, exactly tomorrow.
22 months tomorrow. So congratulations, you're doing great work, and we're really interested in learning more about creating a culture of security in the Jewish community and all the various challenges and dilemmas that we face as a result. So thanks for being with us. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to be head of the Secure Community Network?
So first of all, thank you for having me and for having the Secure Community Network join you today. Shana Tova to you and your family and everyone who's joining us. It's a real honor to be in this position. By background, I'm joining you from our Chicago office. I'm originally from Chicago and served in the Marine Corps after law school. I'm a University of Michigan grad and Harvard Law School for law school and a master's degree from Cambridge, and just grew up in a household very much where public service was valued. So after getting out of the Marine Corps, wound up working for the city of Chicago as the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for the mayor over public safety operations, then spent a number of years in law enforcement as the Chief of Staff of the Chicago Police Department, then joined the Department of Homeland Security, overseeing the Chicago urban area, spent a little bit of time in the private sector, and then had an opportunity to start working with SCN as an advisor. I had first worked with the Secure Community Network and the Chicago Police Department, and a lot of the great work that SCN was doing in helping law enforcement and coordinating with the Jewish community, particularly after a series of threats that we received here in Chicago, and then was really honored to be able to come back to public service and also to be able to put whatever it is I've learned in law enforcement and Homeland Security to work on behalf of our community, our kids in our future.
It's incredible to have somebody so qualified and so reassuring to have somebody so qualified in this position. Tell us a little bit about SCN, how it developed in the past several years.
Sure. So SCN, we're a 501c3. We were formed under the auspices of JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, as well as the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, officially incorporated in 2004. And just for some history, at the time, there were a series of threats coming into the Jewish community, and our partners in federal law enforcement didn't quite know how to get the message out about those threats effectively and in a coordinated manner to the community. And the leadership at the time said, we really need a centralized organization which is made up of law enforcement and security professionals to do this work and to serve in that liaison role. And that was the genesis of SCN, coordinating and liaising with federal law enforcement as well as law enforcement at other levels. And it has grown from there. One of the things, when I took over several years ago, there was a real conversation about how do we make sure that the organization is effectively serving all of our communities. So when we think about the 146 federations of different sizes, the 50 partners of the Conference of Presidents, and the over 300 independent network communities. So we've enhanced our intelligence and information sharing. We have a 24/7 duty desk and operations center, which is working to collect incidents and threats and issues from communities around the country and from our partners like the ADL and others with whom we collaborate every day. And we also then have a series of an operations section which is out in the field responding to incidents. So whether it is Pittsburgh or Poway at the request of both communities, and going back in time from Seattle and Overland Park, we have had an incident response team that has gone to those communities to support them after incidents. And we really work with communities now to develop strategic security frameworks. You know, in the past, people, a synagogue or a community would call and say, can you come in and do a training? And it really, as the father of two kids that are in Jewish day school, it doesn't help me that my kids' Jewish day school is constantly preparing and training, and they have a robust security plan, but then we go to a JCC or a day camp that is at a different level of preparation. So our goal is really to create a consistent, uniform sense of safety and security across our community and across our organizations, recognizing that every organization is different. I always say every house is different, but the building code is the same. So we're working to build those strategic frameworks with our partners and communities around the country.
Great. So this year at Rosh Hashanah services, I was really struck at how much greater the police and security presence was at my synagogue. Have we seen a major uptick, enhancement in security arrangements at synagogues across the country? Is this different this year than past years, or is this different in the past few years than we've seen in decades past?
I think we've certainly seen, particularly after the horrific attacks in Pittsburgh at Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and Orla Simcha, a real understanding. I often got the comment before, after an event, I never thought it could happen here, or why do I have to do this? And the conversation has really transitioned to now, how do we do it in the best manner possible? So we have seen a robust active engagement. I mean, I'll give you some context. From the attack at Tree of Life up through this month, we've received well over 2,000 requests for service and incident reports into our duty desk and into our team. I mean, that's everything from a training request to doing a facility assessment. And comparably, in the 10 months before Tree of Life, that number was about 500. So we have seen that awareness go up. And I think that the key now is how do we harness that awareness to implement best practice. Certainly that happens around the high holidays, and happy to talk about why that's important. But the reality is the high holidays, we're in this period of heightened awareness. We really have to maintain that situational awareness the other 355 days of the year that are not the high holidays as well.
Okay. I've had friends from abroad, Australia, South Africa, Latin America, come to an American Jewish communal event and immediately comment on the lack of security. Now, that might be changing, but I've been told about sort of volunteer security forces that various Jewish communities have deployed. How have we learned anything from how other diaspora Jewish communities do it? How do we compare now to how other diaspora communities think about security?
So I think my first comment often is when we think about, and we hear this a lot from European partners, well, your security looks much different, it feels much different. And my response is always, it should. We have made a lot of progress in this country. We have more work to do, as everywhere does around the world. But I think that if our institutions begin to look like many around the world, where you have military-style security and walls 15, 16 feet high, rung in concertina wire around our synagogues or our day schools, that is a very distinct statement about not only how we view ourselves, but how our country, which should be our country as much as anyone else's, views us. And so I think the key is how do we ensure safety and security while remaining welcome and opening, which is something that we hear all the time for all members of our community. And remembering that our institutions aren't just Jewish institutions, they're community institutions, which are often serving Jews and non-Jews alike. So there's a lot that is different here. Our relationships with law enforcement in this country, I would say in many respects, are far, far different and in many ways much more advanced than other places. We are constantly engaging in intelligence and information sharing with our partners in the FBI, state, and local law enforcement, both pushing information to them and receiving information from them. And that's very, very different than in other places. And I think how we understand the threats is also different. We have threats from foreign terrorist organizations in this country, but our greatest enemy, our greatest adversary, since September 11th, more people in this country have been killed by violent extremists affiliated with white supremacists and neo-Nazis than with Islamist extremists or foreign terrorist organizations. And that is a threat that has to be dealt with very differently than the threat that many other countries are dealing with. And the threat that presents, we are dealing with a mass attack in this country roughly every 2 weeks. And the offenders in those cases are almost wholly well-equipped and very well-trained, either self-trained or trained with others in the use of firearms. And so where we see understanding the professionalized nature of that adversary requires us to have a professional response. That's why we have a team like SCN. It's why we have over 40 security directors at federations and Jewish security directors in communities around the country who have backgrounds in the FBI, Secret Service, Department of State, diplomatic security, and local and state law enforcement. There is a place for volunteers in this society. We've developed with our security directors a best practice greeter usher program. But what we recognize working with law enforcement and amongst our security directors and in local communities is that place is not as it is in most countries, which is outside a synagogue or a shul, unarmed and ill-equipped to deal with not just the threats that we face from armed adversaries, but emotionally disturbed persons who require de-escalation training and crisis intervention training from professionals who are skilled in doing that.
Great. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can do so in the question chat box in your webinar, and we'd be happy to take a look. You mentioned that you're dealing with the dual nature of the threat. One is from Islamists and the other from white supremacists. How closely are you in cooperating with the FBI and other intelligence services? How does that work?
So incredibly closely, and I want to recognize our partners in the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and other organizations. Domestically, literally, we're communicating with the FBI and DHS every single day. Within 25 minutes of the attacks in both Pittsburgh and Poway, our operations team was coordinating with field offices and field agents from those agencies, and I was coordinating with the assistant director and undersecretary level and above at both departments. We serve as the official liaison between the organized Jewish community and federal law enforcement. Over the summer, we sat down, the leadership of the community, with Director Ray, with Acting Secretary McAleenan, to talk about the state of the community. I can tell you that we do not have better partners than those departments and that current leadership, and the relationship has never been stronger. Since Pittsburgh, we have worked with the FBI and with other partners, and we have seen the disruption of plots of individuals seeking to undertake similar attacks at synagogues in Washington State, California, Georgia, Ohio, and elsewhere. That success is a testament to the relationship we've built with the community, and it's a testament between the community and law enforcement. I think, David, to your point, when we see law enforcement at synagogues on the high holidays, we can talk about some of the issues with that, but that responsiveness, that proactive relationship, I would say make friends before you need them. And if the first time we're calling the police department is to report an incident or an issue, then we've generally failed. We need to be engaged and proactive in a way that is accessible and acceptable to our community organizations, but it needs to be an engaged relationship, and they are willing to do that.
You're speaking our language. We in the community relations field like to talk about creating relationships with other groups before you need them, and it would follow that we would need to do so with law enforcement as well. I recently had the opportunity over the summer to visit the Cleveland community, Cleveland Federation, and when I was there was this really impressive security force that happened to be doing some training while we were there, and I learned a little bit about this very impressive, very centralized security operation that is run through the Cleveland Jewish Federation. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is that something that you're just seeing in Cleveland or in other communities, and whether that's something that could be scalable in other places as well?
So I think there's a few things that are I won't say unique, but distinct about Cleveland, and that first and foremost starts with leadership. One of the key founders of SCN, and of course the Federation executive in Cleveland for many, many years, was Steve Hoffman, who prioritized and understood, I believe, the role of Federation and the collective system in our community in providing security, advocated for it, and made it possible. And that remains with the amazing leadership that they put in place over their security program. Oren Baratz, Jim Hartnett, who have led that program, and the many, many committed, Jeff Davis, and the many committed officers, over, I believe now 40, that they have working for them, who are, every single day working on behalf of the community. And of course, Erica, since she's taken over, who's done, just been a complete advocate and continued to grow the program. I think that leadership has been most critical. And there are some clear best practices that I think we've seen come out of the Cleveland program. So for instance, a decision was made. We go into communities all the time. I visited over 90 communities since I took this job 22 months ago. And the disparity in what different organizations are doing, the Federation took it on as their role in Cleveland to eliminate that disparity so that you wouldn't see in one synagogue one security company or one level of security provision, and in day school something different. And the Federation collectively, in asking what is ours to do, assumed that responsibility and created this incredible team of professionals so that they not only ensure consistency in service delivery, but they're able to deliver it more effectively or efficiently. So instead of one synagogue having to hire a security guard for 8 hours on a Saturday for just a morning service, and another synagogue hiring someone for 8 hours but only for a Havdalah service, the way that they're managing it in Cleveland is they can have that one person be deployed across sites and across the community. So I think that's really effective, but it is incredibly labor intensive and requires a very significant commitment from the Federation and the community to do that right and do it well. They've got the model in Cleveland. I think there are specific considerations that communities need to ask themselves if they are going to move down that path, and recognize that that program in Cleveland is a decade old, longer, so that there's a growth trajectory. I think it's a desirable end state, but communities today, if they're starting off right now, they need to be realistic about crawl, walk, run. And one thing that's great about Cleveland is that they have always opened their doors to any community, any leader, or lay leader professional that wanted to come in and see how they do it, so that people can learn from it. And there's a lot to learn from that model. It's great.
Great. One question we've gotten over the transom here is, what should smaller Jewish communities, very often shrinking communities, do about their security challenges? And I would only broaden it. I was going to ask this question: what do institutions that are on the brink financially in general, who already can barely pay the electrical bill every month, what are they supposed to do now with this extra demand for security?
So it's a great question, and it's one that we struggle with, and I think you framed it really well, David. Just as we think about electricity, we have to think about security as a budgeted line item. And there's a reality to that of the different size institutions and communities. So I'll answer in a few ways. On a practical level, one of the things that SCN has worked very hard to do to make things easier is to look across the universe and identify what those best practices are. And so we've developed a series of different guides. For instance, we have a low-cost, no-cost security facility brochure. It's a couple pages long, very simple things. Checking, make sure that you have adequate lighting outside, checking to make sure that your shrubbery is trimmed back so that you're not providing an appearance of a facility that is uncared for or not taking security seriously. Before someone spends $100,000 on an access control system that's electronic or magnetic or biometric, simply, do we have a good lock on the front door? And are we using that? More often than not, we see people spend a lot of money on systems only to be able to walk into a facility because someone's propped the door open with a brick. So a lot of the solutions are actually fairly cost effective. And really what we have seen one of the most effective things that we all can do, and it is so critical, and we've seen it in Pittsburgh, and we saw it in Poway, amidst the tragedy, one thing that was really done well is training. And training doesn't cost a lot of money. It takes our time, but in the process, it not only gives us a script of what to do, it builds our mental resiliency and a sense of empowerment within the community. And that is so critical. And we can involve other stakeholders in that, whether it is law enforcement or other members of the ecumenical community, other faith-based groups. That is something that is a real benefit to the community, and again, doesn't cost a lot of money. So we've come up with those guides and some of that material to help communities. I certainly understand the concern, and I would just point out, as we are moving forward and thinking through what security has to look like for the Jewish community in North America, we are considering that question not as we have to consider it not as individual communities, but as a collective community and as a collective responsibility and obligation. So just like it's not helpful that my kid's day camp may be less prepared than the day school, it doesn't help that one community or one shul in a small rural community is less protected or less engaged than another. The attack, regardless of where it happens, size, location, or affiliation of the institution, will be felt by all of us as a community, and we have to therefore prepare for it that way.
Great. So not everyone in the Jewish world is so enthusiastic about strengthening, especially the armed presence at Jewish institutions. I heard one progressive Jewish leader call it the militarization of Jewish life, and there's actually a question on here that reflects this. What do we do about segments of the Jewish community that might not have had great histories of interaction with law enforcement and may feel more rather than less vulnerable with the increase of security at their Jewish institutions?
I think it's an incredibly important question, and it's one that we've certainly gotten more over the last couple of years. And having served as the chief of staff for the second largest local law enforcement agency in this country, it's one that I've thought about and struggled with myself on any number of occasions. Let me just say, with respect to the threat itself, when we are aware of the incredible proliferation of firearms in this society and the use of those weapons to attack innocent individuals, there is I think a responsibility when we have community institutions to consider how do we protect them and ensure that they are safe and secure. So that's a first question. And an issue that we have to deal with. The reality is that we know that many communities and many individuals in communities have, there has been a lack of trust with law enforcement. That is broader than our community, but it does not negate the reality that we have to deal with it. I'm a big believer in nothing about, I always say nothing about you without you. So if we are going to develop security plans and procedures at our institutions, they need to engage the whole community that is a part of that institution. And that means people that are favorable towards law enforcement, that are unfavorable towards law enforcement, or unfavorable to any armed presence. And making sure that we have that conversation wholly, and we should engage law enforcement. The reality is law enforcement, there are many agencies that have done a lot in this country over the last several years in terms of de-escalation training, critical incident or crisis intervention training, trying to implement policies and procedures, body cameras, et cetera, to increase accountability and transparency. We have a lot more to go. And no piece of technology is going to lessen a feeling of institutional or historic concern. But we have to have the conversation. And I think we can have that conversation by saying to law enforcement, you have a duty and an obligation to protect and serve our community, regardless of what the community looks like or who they are, and we need to figure out how that can be a productive, proactive relationship. Each institution needs to make its own decision at the end of the day. And that spans the gamut. It's not just, as the term was used with me with a professional yesterday, Jews of different hues, but it's also someone like me that might be walking into an Orthodox synagogue and feeling that otherness, and how do we make accepting and open environments. One thing from a professional perspective, as a security professional, that I would point out is one of the things that we have seen as law enforcement has worked, not gotten there yet, but has worked around the country to improve training on certain issues. We have seen an increased disparity between law enforcement and private security forces. So where people might have said 10 years ago, well, there are concerns about law enforcement, so we'll hire a private security force, the nature of the issues that our institutions have to face, emotionally disturbed people, people of different appearance, different backgrounds, LGBTQ communities, et cetera, we are often seeing that law enforcement now, in many areas, is much better equipped at having those conversations and being open to them than private security guard forces, which generally have less training on those issues, not just less training on how to carry or use a firearm, but very often no training on cultural sensitivity, verbal de-escalation techniques, or crisis intervention. So it's a very dynamic and shifting field right now, and it needs to be a robust conversation in the community.
Right. We've gotten a lot of questions, and we're not going to have enough time to go into them, about sort of how you do it at a local congregation. Can you tell us, if a local congregation or institution wants help, how do they go about contacting you, or who should they contact, and where are some of the resources located for that?
So great question. So one, our duty desk, which is our 24/7 operations center, is available, and we have an 800 number. It's on our website. A few ways that you can be involved. Sign up for our daily update. Every day we're putting out an open source news summary of security and safety issues impacting the Jewish community. We have a special listserv for security liaisons for Jewish organizations. So if you are the head of a security committee, or you're involved in security with an institution or a community, email the duty desk, dutydesk@securecommunitynetwork.org, and they can put you on that special list, which makes information and resources available. We're about to redo our whole website to make it much more user-friendly. But a lot of those resources we put out through the duty desk, or we can provide to people, or they're posted on our website. With respect to getting engaged,
your website? Give us your website.
It's www.securecommunitynetwork.org.
Great.
And we'll get all of that to you, and if we can email it out or whatever makes sense. With respect to working with communities, how we approach a community, I mentioned that strategic security framework before. Generally, most effectively to work through a public affairs council, or a JCRC, or a federation. And what we like to do is work with a community to assess all of the institutions across the community. And why that's important is because we have to establish a baseline and a standard for the community, both with respect to the physical infrastructure, but also the sentiment of the community. What does each institution want? How do they want to look? How do they want to feel? And then what we do is work to raise the institutions to that baseline. And that looks different. It's going to look different for a day school than a synagogue, but we're trying to get that consistency and that uniformity, even though the solution sets are going to be different. And that's a combination, sometimes of physical infrastructure or physical upgrades, some low cost, no cost. Sometimes there might be cost, and the assessments help entities apply for the grants, which we have resources related to. And then a lot of it comes down to training. Just like we do with fire drills in this country, as we've done for the last 70 years, we want to train the community uniformly on how to respond to incidents, how to identify suspicious behavior appropriately. Not a person because they look differently, but a person's behavior because they're acting in a way that might be problematic. Active threat, active shooter response, emergency procedures, how to call 911, what you need to know to identify a suspicious package. And that's how we tend to work with communities. So we like to convene and coordinate through a JCRC or federation generally, but please contact the duty desk, and we're happy to work with you on how that makes the most sense.
Fantastic. With your permission, we'll go a bit beyond the 30-minute mark here, because there's a lot of questions coming in. I personally have a couple more key questions for you. I cannot not ask this question. What would you say to a rabbi or a leader of another institution if a congregant asked the rabbi if he could bring or she could bring a firearm to synagogue, concealed carry. I may or may not have a close family member who has requested that from his or her rabbi. How would you advise them on that?
So we get this question a lot, not surprisingly. One thing I'll point out, we actually have convened a group of national leaders, law enforcement executives, as well as security directors to actually work on a national policy and a guidebook, so to speak, not a policy, but a process map. And what this really does need to be is a decision tree for an institution. So my first two questions are usually back to the rabbi. What is your policy as the rabbi? Because if the rabbi says, I don't want firearms in my congregation, then that's the decision that stands. If it's, I'm open to considering options, then we have to run through a series of questions to get to a policy statement. So my next question is usually, what's the objective of having that individual in the institution? And if the objective is to make them feel better, that's one thing. If the objective is to say, I want someone in the building that can deter or neutralize a threat, that's a different objective. And then we have a whole series of questions that we usually will run through. Have you looked at state law? Have you spoken to your insurance carrier? Even if the person's not an employee of the shul or the synagogue, if you know that they're carrying a firearm, or you've asked them to carry a firearm and take action, that's going to implicate your insurance policy and very distinct and often hefty liability concerns. What type of training are you going to have in place? How often are they going to train? Who's going to lead them? Who's going to supervise them? Have you spoken to local law enforcement? I can tell you this still I serve as a part-time police officer, and I'm trained as a SWAT officer. When police officers respond to an active threat situation, if they don't have prior information and they see someone with a gun in the middle of a synagogue, and that person is not clearly identified as law enforcement, or they don't know that's a congregant, the outcome is often not going to be a good one for the individual carrying that firearm. So these are the sorts of questions that we ask, and what we've found that most institutions come to is a decision not to allow a layperson or civilian to carry a firearm in an institution. They will often come to a different conclusion about ensuring that if this is really a concern or there's a problem, we're going to look to some different solution sets. Access control, different types of training, and if we are going to have someone in the facility, we are going to look to have a professional who is highly trained and capable of addressing the threat that we're concerned about.
Great. Thank you for that. So I think I'm going to give you one more question before we end. Jewish federations and some JCRCs have been very active at the federal, state, and local levels, advocating for government funding for security measures. How important is that funding, and do we need more of it?
It is absolutely critical. I served for 2 years as the co-chair of the grant review task force for the two secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security. And in our evaluation, looking across the country, seeing the impact that that nonprofit security grant program made at the federal level was demonstrable to our houses of worship and nonprofit organizations. And it was demonstrable not just for an active threat situation, but ensuring that our children were safe from sexual predators, ensuring that workplace violence issues or domestic disturbance issues, there were policies in place, there were tools in place to address those. That program was funded thanks in large part to the work of JFNA and individual federations, JCPA, JCRCs, at $60 million. And over the last 2 or 3 years, the funds have been available to more communities, not just communities in urban areas, but rural communities as well, where we increasingly see the threat. And the funding has been allowed to be spent in more dynamic ways, both physical security, but also now training and planning. I can tell you the requests for that funding far exceed the $60 million. So I think there is a open conversation going on about what does the number need to be. I would like to see the number be a lot higher. We have to work within the realm of what is possible and probable. I also think there's an increasing role that states are recognizing. That's why we see a proliferation of state programs. Ohio's been a leader in this, the Cleveland Federation, and some of our colleagues in Ohio, individuals like Howie Beagleman who've worked hard on these programs, our partners like the OU, which have worked hard on these programs. We're seeing them spread from several states now to close to a dozen that have them or are considering them. So the answer is, I think this is a work in progress. I'd like to see more funding available. In the interim, though, we have to do what is necessary as a collective community to really come together to address this issue. Just as we have done internationally for other issues, whether it's crises in Israel, intifadas, or droughts, whether it is for issues of, for instance, Soviet Jewry or Ethiopian Jewry, I think we are at a moment in this country where the future of our community is really dependent on the level of comfort of American and North American Jews walking into our institutions and feeling safe and secure. And we have a collective obligation to make that possible for ourselves and for our children and for our future generations, so that this community can continue to be vibrant and dynamic and a contributory part of American society.
Michael, thank you so much. This has been enormously helpful for us, and I think we could go on and on and on, but it's, this is a 30-minute webcast and we want to keep to that. But we're very grateful for your time and for the work that you do. And as I said in the beginning, to have someone of your training and education and commitment doing this work on our behalf. Thanks so much.
It's an honor. Thank you. Happy New Year and Gmar Chatima Tova to everyone.
Thanks very much. Please join us for our next CRCast on October 17th at 1 p.m. with Amanda Berman, who is the Executive Director of Zioness, which is a new organization, and we're going to be talking to her about the role of progressive Zionists in the social justice issues of our time. It's going to be a very interesting webcast, and we hope you'll be able to join us. In the meantime, Happy New Year and Gemar Tov. Thanks very much. Take care.